Warning, this review will contain spoilers, so if you haven't seen this film, go watch it first. But if you decide to go on regardless and not heed this warning, it's your own fault, so do not blame me in any capacity. Considering that the first Equestria Girls film got mixed reactions from fans and critics alike, it was obvious that Rainbow Rocks didn't have to do a lot to get them back on track. As for me, well, I was apprehensive that this film could even recoup my interest in this franchise after my initial viewing of its predecessor, which, spoiler alert, did not go terribly well. Knowing that the setting, characters, and overarching conflicts between magic and realism were set in stone, the sequel did not have to go to such laborious lengths as its predecessor to create very much in its runtime. It had the opportunity to build on what the original had left behind and make something that could certainly take advantage of the carefree and occasionally intense atmosphere that the predecessor founded to make it an engaging and fun film that would in many eyes repair the issues that still laid before it. Now while that sounds easy, it's trickier than you might think, because while a Battle of the Bands sounds like a fantastic idea on paper, it is all about the execution and how we as viewers perceive it. This will determine if it works, and whether Hasbro have been able to hit the right tone in the process. The first Equestria Girls film did pretty well for itself, based on the money it made from the doll merchandise, the cinema tickets, and the DVD sales to ensure that Rainbow Rocks got commissioned. But on top of that, Hasbro thought to themselves, we can make even more money by embracing online media, since Friendship Magic already made waves with bronies and fans alike, generating musical content to rival the ones the show was making. They thought to themselves, if we can get a slice of that pie by utilising the music in this film to appeal to an even wider audience, the musical fun will embrace many, and it will be quite fantastic. Well, seeing as Welcome to the Show has now hit over 105 million views on YouTube, I think they were right to believe it was indeed possible. So if they manage to push the music in the right direction and ensure that the story ties up with it, maybe this film has a chance at real success. Surprisingly though, that wasn't the case based on what I saw. You'd think with a Battle of the Bands centered plot and music in abundance alongside the opportunity to create eye-watering animation to go along with it, that it would be difficult to imagine that it could go wrong. Then again, it went catastrophically wrong. Now how would you mess up something so simple, you may ask? Well, it was easy, by focusing less on the music and more on the meaningless internal conflict between the main five, Sunset Shimmer, and a shoehorned Twilight Sparkle. Of course, there are feuds between bands and their members, but to have it be the core plot that progressed across the whole film was concerning and quite brazen, as it wasn't what I or many signed up for. Did this story of a band coming together to defeat powerful mystical entities in the Sirens feel uplifting and full of musical vigour to match? No, because those same villains did not feel as intimidating as they should have, while the laborious and tepid attempts to force drama into a plot meant that the music took a back seat for most of it, becoming incredibly difficult to sit through in the process. Now, why did the Rainbooms have to write a new song to pony up when performing naturally would have resolved this conflict super quickly? Well, obviously, if that had happened, we would not have had a movie to work with, but it could have been executed with some semblance of care, as this conflict led to predictability, which when coupled with a slow pace and bad writing of the characters placed within it, you get quite a damning showing. And by forcing Pony Twilight into the film, it padded out the menial premise and wasted a lot of time that could have actually been served a lot better by dedicating it to the music, instead of focusing on pointless bickering while the main villains made their presence felt in song, but waited for their cues without much fanfare. And having characters like Trixie be their normal selves defeated the point of the Sirens' mind-altering powers, making them feel useless until their true forms were revealed. And on top of that, when your film project ends with the entire Battle of the Bands concept that has been driven through this whole film becoming null, void, and meaningless, you know that you have failed. Trixie won, as the Dazzlings forfeited due to the Rainbooms interfering, right? So why was she angry at the end? That makes no sense. You know something is wrong if all I've just highlighted is painfully apparent. And with barely a laugh coming from this enthusiasm vacuum of a story, with most of the characters barely doing anything entertaining to compromise that, it makes me question how they managed to do this so badly. It's simple when you realise that this film got its identity wrong, because instead of an uplifting and rousing underdog story about Sunset overcoming her adversities by the use of friendship and music to signify her character development and change, what we got was a conflict that was unnecessary and incredibly dumbed down to the point where no one benefited from it, and it hit you with as much subtlety as a brick to the face. This film had a very easy, simple story to tell, and the task of doing it was not a heavy one, but they thought, you know what, it looks a bit light, let's convolute it, expand it, and honestly, overcomplicate it to the point where it overtakes everything and sucks the fun out of something that should have been enjoyable. Because seriously, this should have been the easiest job in the world for Megan McCarthy to do. And somehow, through a lack of care, it did not manage to work. And you know what? This is only the beginning of my issues. The writing, as you may be aware already, has got a lot of issues thanks to the characters that are driving the plot, either doing too much in a limited role or not enough in a film that they should be thriving in. All the main 6 characters, including Twilight, fit their usual personality characteristics with no variance there. Trixie is just Trixie, we've already seen that before, and Spike is the sarcastic and snide character you would expect to see in the main show, rather than the understanding and warm one we saw last time out. And while it works, with the antagonism of Plenty being around and it offering a nice contrast, it doesn't however hit the mark for comedy, which this film obviously is missing. The Dazzlings, while showing differing and intriguing personality traits, with one of them being an adorable cinnamon roll but does not deserve to be amongst them. But while they are menacing and worthy antagonists in song, as I've already made aware, and I've already made aware of this too, they aren't anywhere close to that in normality, with confronting Sunset in a near shot-for-shot remake of her encounter with Twilight the film prior, and controlling the principals being the only smidgens of menace that were actually highlighted. And speaking of Sunset Shimmer, when you strip away the rest of the cast, she's the only positive spoke on the wheel this film has left, delivering a sympathetic, anxious and introspective character who had fallen far from her prior status, and with the progression that this film gave to her, it made me smile as she finally got accepted by the school and her crew outright. Too bad it didn't make me feel nearly as good as it could have, considering that the message didn't have anywhere near the same impact as the last film to further compound my misery. The core moral of understanding your friends and how difficult communicating can be is very mundane, as the togetherness and strength of friendship bond was rarely ever noted thanks to so much antagonism and aggression going around them, to where this moral becomes so easily foreshadowable and incredibly hollow, I saw no benefit to the viewer or the characters as a whole, especially when those characters were willing to accept their faults and come together even though they had nearly ended their friendship through arguments just moments prior to that. And while I commend the emotive delivery of this message by Twilight and Sunset to make it as intense as possible, the subsequent turn really does ruin it, leaving me annoyed as the climax to this film threw as much musical and animation bribes at me in the hope that it would make amends and make me speak of it in goodwill. As you can probably tell, it didn't end up working as well as you may think. On top of that, while the voice acting was solid, it wasn't as varied or complex as I expected it to be, thanks to the linearity of the dramatic tone that this film persevered with, yet another blemish on its record. So as you could tell, thematic and constructive problems abound, at least in my opinion, have rendered this film looking like quite a bit of a mess. It's up to the music and visual aspects of it to try and save some face, as it's all the hope I have of this film even getting anywhere near my good books. Thankfully though, the music and visuals did manage to do something. However, not without causing some problems for themselves. With a total of 11 songs on this film's soundtrack, they certainly packed it to the rafters with enough to fill its runtime with fun, varied, and decent music, right? However, this wasn't entirely the case, as only 5 of them got my attention and subsequent adoration, while too many of them were interrupted or obscured by character dialogue, forcing me away from what I came to this film for, and it meant that I was already loathing it in droves by the time it got to its near midpoint, which was actually the battle itself. In fact, from the opening title track, it took 50 minutes to get to a song that I actually enjoyed in Under Our Spell. Just like the first film did in having its story take an age to actually go somewhere, this had pretty much the exact same effect on the quality of the music, which meant I had to sit through mundane songs like Better Than Ever, Shake Your Tail, which was again embroiled in story progression to really have no impact at all, and of course the absolute drizzling shits of this entire musical ensemble, Snips and Snails rapping, which of course we got in its entirety, while most of the competition got obscured by the Dazzling's vocals in that already noted musical number of Under Our Spell. So what is the point of having the contest if we don't even get to hear most of it? Sure, timing is definitely a factor, but how the hell did we get stuck with a surefire wooden spoon? What was the purpose of that, outside of just trying to shoehorn a piece of really bad cringe comedy into a film that had no laughs at all? Not just that, outside of the genre complexity that was Welcome to the Show, we got some dance pop from the first film as well, dominating most of the soundtrack, robbing me of much of my delight as I was hoping to see some different genres of metal, of folk, of country, or even some decent rock as well. But no, we got very little of that, as these musical numbers stagnated despite some enjoyment being had, as the background music, while occasionally offering some slivers of excitement, were left aggrieved at the musical numbers' abundance. However, amongst that annoying sense of disappointment, the songs, expectedly, contained the best use of animation the film offered up, with effects, transitions, and lighting being used to great effect to make them seem absolutely stunning, with Welcome to the Show, Under Our Spell, and the title track doing so in particular in very spectacular fashion. And speaking of which, the occasional new outfits were lovely to see, as were some great facial expressions. Again, it's something you should expect by now. And while most of these are very large elements that mean this category can score well, they were the only parts of visual clarity in the entire film. Sure, they were massive contributions, but that return is dumbfounding, which again highlights the major source of contention with this feature-length film. It focused on the wrong things, much to its noted detriment. So after all that, I come to the conclusion that this film profoundly frustrates me, because we had the potential for a slice-of-life, musical, fairground extravaganza to come before us, and while there were glimpses of that on show, there were so many rebellious wrong turns that spoilt it, meaning that it never lived up to the expectations that I held for it. And at the end of the day, I am surprised that this film did not score any lower than what I am about to give it. Putting it bluntly, when I first saw this film in January 2015 on Tiny Pop, I thought it was better than the first film, but not by much. However, nearly 3 years after that fact, this film's credibility fell apart in front of my eyes, all because it messed up a simple as hell story and premise by overcomplicating it and taking it away from what it needed to be, which meant it reaped very little rewards, as it was robbed of being fun and dragged its dramatic heels through the mud, which compromised the music, message, animation, and writing collectively, stopping them from trying to save it from almost certain damnation. Now sure, the visual and audio elements were ensuring that this looks a fine sight better than it would have otherwise, but it was still underdone in the broader scope of things, while the writing and message were not given enough attention, looking quite feeble despite some signs of what might have been coming to the forefront. And for this film to think it was brazen enough to try and sell itself for something it wasn't is one thing. To believe that Megan McCarthy could even try to get away with it is nigh on criminal. Just because you have a very loose premise does not mean you can try to wrap it up in a few songs, some new villains, and a small amount of character development and tell me it's all fine, because unlike the students of Canterlot High, I was not under this spell, especially as it spectacularly unravelled in front of me. All in all, while moments and segments of this film showed promise, a lot of it is nigh on unwatchable. It was that unpleasant. And if they'd removed Twilight from proceedings and focused on the competition and the character that should have been at the root of this story in Sunset, maybe these issues would not have been as bad. And while some aspects of the production save it from being utterly terrible, it doesn't escape my ire. And while it does better than some of the main show episodes, to do so many wrong things on a feature level means that it has to be held accountable on a level entirely occupied by itself. And I can understand why some fans find this to be nothing more than escapist fun, but for me, critically, it just didn't achieve anywhere near what I expected from it. Overall, Rainbow Rocks scored a total of 7 out of 25. Which is a D-. In closing, I can see why this film failed when Hasbro took much more pleasure in promoting the musical numbers and the musical shorts that followed this film's release online, because they obviously made the waves, showcasing how little they cared for everything that surrounded them. Meaning that this film more than hell deserves the rating I've given it, because even though it did manage to save its own bacon stunningly, it did so with a bit of a whimper, because seriously, this film feels more phoned in and more of a merchandising ploy than the first one did, and I don't understand how that's technically possible. But all I'm hoping is we've got a few more reviews to come, and I'm praying they don't reach anywhere near this level, or even lower, because if they do, oh boy, we are going to have a lot of problems on our hands. Friendship games, you have a lot to do to better this. Because if you don't end up doing that, I am going to be very unhappy when the next review comes round. I have been Freddie Thomas, you've been people watching, this has been the Rainbow Rocks film review as part of Equestria Girls Month for the CC Network. And I will see you all next time.